shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday.
Hello, my name is Christy Nana. The following podcast is about the history of African American education as it pertains to desegregation and resegregation in the American school system. I obtained information from the text, How Did Desegregation Happen? An American Historical Overview. I used excerpts from multimedia sources to demonstrate the concept of desegregation and resegregation as it happened. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Integrated schools seemed like an impossible pipe dream, except to the Brown family.
Somebody had to start it, my father said. Somebody had to take a stand. I remember that my father took me by the hand and we walked together to Sumner School. My father tried to enroll me in the school for the next year, and they told him that I couldn't go there because I was a Negro. Then he asked to see the principal.
When the Reverend Oliver Brown returned home that day, he was extremely angry. His simple request had been denied. He also knew he had to do something dramatic if changes were to take place. So, he went to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, for assistance. They filed a lawsuit in Topeka in order to seek action through the court on the principle that educational facilities for black children were inadequate. In order to understand what happened next, let me explain some background. Until the Civil War, most black Americans had lived under slavery in the South. The few free blacks in the North usually lived in segregated communities, and this continued until the late 19th century. 20 years after the Civil War, Southern states began enacting so-called Jim Crow laws. These laws began barring blacks, or colored, as they were called then, from most social interaction with white citizens.
May 17th, 1954. In Washington, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down racially segregated public schools as separate and unequal. The court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka fuels America's civil rights movement and the eventual end of legal segregation in the United States.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Many Americans imagine that the civil rights movement ended when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968.
Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones to form an arch, singly none.
One of the most historical events was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which included federal measures to ensure school desegregation. Subsequent congressional action and a series of Supreme Court rulings in the late 1960s and early 1970s compelled public school districts, East and West, North and South, to integrate.
All persons
All persons
shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment
of the goods, services,
facilities
and privileges,
advantages
and accommodations
of any place of public accommodation
without discrimination
or segregation
on the grounds of race,
color,
religion,
or national origin.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Title II.
There's more to the act than that one sentence.
There's a lot more to it. But for right now, let's all keep working on getting that part right.
From 1969 to 1972, the percentage of African Americans attending Southern schools that were at least 90% black dropped precipitously from 78% to 25%. Soon districts from California to Colorado, Michigan, and Massachusetts followed suit. They did so in all sorts of ways. Some redrew school attendance zones to pull in students from black and white neighborhoods. Others paired all black and all white schools so that one became an integrated school for grades 1 through 3, while the other handled grades 4 through 6. Some districts bused children to schools outside their neighborhoods to achieve racial balance, the most incendiary approach by far.
Next time on Eyes on the Prize. Once again, schools became the battleground for civil rights, but this time in the North, in Boston.
We wanted them to acknowledge that the problem exists and to commit themselves to do something about it.
There were crowded classrooms, temporary teachers, not enough books.
You can hear people saying, niggas go home, black people stay out, we don't want any niggers in our school.
The keys to the kingdom. Next time on Eyes on the Prize.
Though segregation swept first through the South, now it was the rest of the country's turn. The percentage of black students attending racially isolated schools in the United States dropped significantly from 64 to 36%. It was a volatile time when white liberals and moderates found their progressive convictions tested in their own neighborhoods. Busing became one of the dominant political issues of the decade. Despite court decisions and aggressive federal measures, many school districts never desegregated. Hastily built private academies drained public schools of white children. In 1974, a watershed Supreme Court decision barred cities from achieving racial balance in schools by busing children from adjoining suburbs if it meant crossing district lines. The ruling effectively killed the possibility of meaningful racial desegregation in many urban areas. Still, communities nationwide did desegregate, some with striking success. Children starting kindergarten in the late 1960s were more likely than ever to enter a racially mixed school. In the 1970s, unprecedented numbers of black, white, Latino, and Asian students moved through their elementary years and into high school together. The early 1980s marked America's peak in the long campaign to desegregate public schools. Indeed, public schools in the South, once bastions of Jim Crow segregation, were the most integrated in the United States.
The greater Cleveland community interpreted the desegregation order to be to mix the races. It really wasn't. The desegregation order was to offer equitable opportunity for good teachers and materials. And by the children coming together, all children see that they have more in common than there are differences. I will not ever forget the first day or so of when they transported the kids. And when they got off the bus, they just automatically made friends. And that's the beauty of being a child. You know, you made them feel welcome and they got together and had a good time. It was really a very worthwhile experience.
By the early 1990s, the trend toward school desegregation had begun to reverse. By the late 1990s, some courts even barred school districts from voluntary desegregation efforts. The Supreme Court decision of June 2007 is likely to accelerate that trend. The decision came in two cases from Seattle and Louisville. In both cases, white parents filed suit after their children were denied admission to the public schools of their choice because of their race.
The most recent data shows the average white student goes to a school that's more than 70% white, and less than a quarter of black students go to majority white schools. Jeffrey Brown takes a look at whatever happened to integration.
Cheryl Cashin, it is more, not less common that American schools are segregated, are more segregated these days.
Right. In the 70s and 80s, many school districts around the country were court orders to desegregate, and in the 90s, the Supreme Court basically signaled it was time for courts to stop policing desegregation, and 2/3 of the school districts that had been under desegregation orders have come out from under them, and we've had a rapid, massive resegregation since 1988.
And have we largely given up on the idea of integration?
Well, I hope that's not true. There are about 80 school districts in this country that voluntarily have school integration plans. They tend to use economic integration as their model rather than race because the Supreme Court makes it hard. But those 80 school districts are out there trying without a lot of encouragement, frankly, from the federal government or others. So I hope because they're successful places like Louisville, like Montgomery County, Maryland, increasingly people are looking to the Hartford example, where 45 magnet schools that are well-resourced and integrated have been built because of a lawsuit, and there's a multiracial coalition of parents, the Chef movement, that supports it. So there are positive examples out there. I hope
we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall